There's a lot of little important things in this build, so I'd recommend watching the whole thing before just yoinking the PoE. It might save you a lot of headache. So I wanted to revisit Volatile Dead Spellslinger. They gave it a bit more damage this patch, but the removal of the Reservation Mastery hit one of Spellslinger's existing pain points. Reservation's kinda rough on builds that require multiple Spellslinger setups. The corpse life nerfs on top of that also make this style of Spellslinger harder to do, but hey, I really liked the playstyle in the past, so I thought I'd try to make it work. The cost of this build is surprisingly not that high, save for a few luxuries that aren't strictly necessary. With my current investment, maps are super comfy and you can just stand still and right-click pinnacle bosses. Versus Ubers though, you'll actually have to dodge and interact with mechanics. The build's lacking a little damage and durability to be able to comfortably do the Uber bosses deathless, so you'll need to actually try to play well. It's kinda hard to see the ground with this build, so in stuff like Uber Cirrus, it can get really tough with the storm spawning in the middle of the arena. In order to fit in more auras, we're going low life with the Captain Lance tech, which is coruscating elixir permanently sustained with the Trader Timeless Keystone. This frees up your chest slot for something like a nice rare regalia, or in our case, the Ivory Tower, which is a nice cheap option that gives us the equivalent of like 1200 flat ES in this setup. Since we're low life and we don't need to worry about life regen, we can use Kaom's Spirit to generate rage to enable berserk, which gives us a lot of speed and tankiness. And as an Inquisitor, we'll still be able to benefit from the life regen that we invest into for rage generation, cause it'll also be applied to our energy shield due to Pious Path. We also make really good use of Righteous Providence, since scaling strength will give us crit chance, spell damage from Iron Will, flat life for Ivory Tower, and better rage generation from percent life regen due to having more life. I originally also wanted to use Radiant Faith Forbidden Jewels for more life stacking synergy, but the red one just didn't exist on the market when I checked, so I scrapped that idea. This build has mostly generic spell scaling, so you can probably slot in any spell you like. I went for Volatile Dead because the playstyle is so comfy, and the spell scaling on it is actually not that bad. Detonate Dead on the other hand has more of its damage built into the Corpse Explosion, which isn't scaled by spell modifiers, but it works well with the spell cascade that we're already using for Volatile Dead, and mapping feels a lot nicer when you have something with instant damage. Volatile Dead has a little delay before the balls start moving, and since we're not really scaling the initial corpse explosion part, it can feel kinda awkward just waiting for the balls to move. Not to mention, the faster you kill something, the less time it has to hit you. Mapping is really nice. Since it's pretty much a one-button build, Berserk, which we have on our left click, makes you run really fast, and you only need to use flasks once at the beginning. We attack really fast too, since we're using faster attacks in our Frenzy setup. I'll talk more about attack speed and cooldowns in the next section, but for mapping, the more attack speed the better since we'll be moving in between every cast. If you want to go faster, you can actually cancel the barrage animation with a movement input. So instead of just holding down left click or whatever you have your movement key bound to, let go of it when you use Frenzy and press it again to cut the animation short. For anything a bit tanky, you can pop Frost Shield and right click it to death. For particularly spooky essences, you might need to kite it. For bosses and invitations, you can swap the quicksilver for a sapphire flask for the less cold damage taken. You can keep the quicksilver for things that don't have cold damage, like Exarch's barrage spell is a lot easier to avoid with more move speed. We'll also be swapping out faster attacks for Culling Strike and increased AoE for Conk Effect. An awakened elemental focus might seem like more damage, but with Spell Cascade, Conk Effect seems to let you get more overlaps with DD. That also allows us to use Sadist for 60% increased damage since we'll be able to apply ailments. For the Uber bosses, I opted to manually cast Berserk, saving it for the little mini games. So like for Uber Shaper's Bullet Hell phase, I pop Berserk for the damage reduction and Vol Molten Shell if it's up. I haven't died once in that phase ever since I made this adaptation. For Cirrus's Meteor phase, the move speed from Berserk is really helpful, and Eater's Inescapable Doom is also a lot easier with Berserk. Since we have a bunch of variables that'll affect our attack speed, I didn't really bother with matching my attack rate with Spellslinger's cooldown, and honestly, it doesn't really matter too much in this build. Since we're using barrage support, we don't really have to get our attack speed too exact. At worst, we delay a cast every now and then when our windup animation syncs up with our spells coming off cooldown, but attacking a bit before your spells are up is fine, cause barrage extends your attack time. Without barrage support, it would be more of a problem though, cause then you'd actually be missing casts. But all this only really matters when you're just standing still holding down right click, and you don't really need the little extra damage for anything except for Uber bosses where you can't actually just stand still anyway. And since frenzy charges, frenzy, rage, and berserk will all variably adjust your attack speed, slowing down your attack rate to optimize it for when you're fully buffed doesn't really make sense, cause you're just introducing extra clunkiness for when you're not at full attack speed. Now, it is actually possible to have too much attack speed for when you're casting multiple times in a row, so I recommend getting enough to make it feel good for you whilst not having it so fast that you're constantly missing triggers. If you look at my skill bar throughout the video, you'll notice that I have my Volatile deb there to monitor my trigger rate along with just overall feeling. An easy way to test out different attack speeds is by changing your frenzy gem. The default quality gives attack speed, Divergent and Phantasmal don't affect anything, and Anomalous adds another projectile at 20% quality. With Barrage support, this will add another projectile to the end of the sequence, increasing your attack time. If you're using Ashes of the Stars, then it can add a second additional projectile. If you want to only add one additional projectile while using Ashes, you'll need a lower quality gem. Just make sure the total quality is below 40%. Other than the Ashes and Grand Spectrum, which don't give us that much, the gear's pretty cheap. Most of my rares were just essence spammed. The general stats you want on your rares are ES, Strength, Int, Resistances, and Life and Mana aren't bad either. On your belt, you need a high roll on a flask mod. I'm using increased charges gained, but reduced charges used and increased duration should also be fine, though you might need to roll different prefixes on your flasks. Try to get some reservation efficiency on your helmet. You also want the reservation enchant, but if you drop DD and just use a 6-link Volatile dead, you might be able to run the cooldown enchant, which will probably be a DPS increase. It'll also make the playstyle a lot more comfortable versus uber bosses, cause then you don't really need to aim, which reduces how much you need to move your mouse. Just make sure you know the cooldown breakpoints, so you don't waste any affixes on cooldown recovery. I'll link a Reddit post with a table and explanation in the description. On your weapon, just try to get as much flat damage as possible. Instead of Ashes, you can use a nice rare +1 amulet to fill out the stats you need to make gearing easier, or maybe an All's Uprising to help with reservation. Honestly, the Ashes is only used for the reservation, and extra quality for our Divergent Volatile dead, which makes the balls move faster. We also get a little more spell damage from Divergent Berserk's quality, but after I started saving Berserk for the minigames and the Uber fights, I think I prefer Anomalous Berserk for better uptime, and you don't really need the extra damage for anything else. As for the Endurance Charge Grand Spectrum, you can use another crit one if you need more crit, or actually just drop the Grand Spectrum package altogether and just use rare jewels. Okay, as I'm writing this script, I noticed that the Instruments of Virtue Forbidden Jewels are really cheap right now, like under 1 divine for the pair. And as long as you have decent flat damage on your weapon, they'll outperform rare jewels, so I'll add them to the POB. All the clips in this video were recorded with just basic crit multi-jewels. The Forbidden Flesh and Flame gives you like 10% more damage in this setup. This build really starts to come together once you get more levels and gear together, so don't be too discouraged if it feels kind of rough at like level 84. Once you get that cluster set up and fill in your crit, your damage will feel a lot better. Getting close to capping your crit is actually really important on this character because you ignore resistances on crits. I'm getting a little crit from a lot of different sources, but if you're in need for a lot of crit, try a diamond flask like this, or use more crit Grand Spectrums. Mana is also something you're gonna have to figure out. You'll need enough reservation efficiency to have enough unreserved mana to trigger all your spells. Using Inspiration instead of Conk Effect will make this super easy because it has a lower reservation multiplier, and it reduces the triggered mana cost. Combined with minus mana rings, you might not even need the reduced mana on your flask. If you just need a little more mana, maybe you can try using Elemental Focus, but then you'd want to use a different cluster without Sadist. I recommend calculating this on POB first or test it with a tabula. Constantly changing your setup is a good way to waste 1,000 chromes. If you really need it, you can take some reservation on the tree, you have some options nearby. And as a last resort, you could drop Tempest Shield, but then you'd want some other source of reduced shock effect. There are a lot of moving parts in this build. Changing one thing can have an effect on something else, like for example, if you get a little more reservation on your gear, you might be able to drop some reservation nodes on the tree and add another jewel. If you're able to get enough crit, you could drop the diamond flask in exchange for a topaz flask, which might give you enough resists to open up another gear slot. Hopefully, I've given you enough information to understand every choice I made in the POB so you can troubleshoot and make your own choices, cause not everyone will be able to get the same gear as me, like being a little off on reservation rolls might cause issues, and that would have been a good way to end the video, but I still need to talk about leveling. So slap on some leveling uniques and do whatever you want until level 12. I just use Frostbolt, Rolling Magma is a good option too. At level 12, use a Poet's Pen with whatever spell you like, and you're pretty much spellslinging already. Also put on a Doedri's Tenure for a free 100% spell damage. The reduced cast speed doesn't affect us. At level 20, Rigwald's Crest just for the wolves. At level 24, you can start using Spellslinger. I used Purifying Flame and replaced my Poet's Pen setup with Wave of Conviction. Or maybe it was the other way around, I don't quite remember. Do whatever feels better for you. I chose these spells cause I could use Hatred, which also benefits my Spectral Wolves from the ring. Feel free to use whatever you want on your other gear slots. This was my setup until endgame when I switched to VDDD. You can probably swap at like Blood Aqueducts if you prefer. Alright, that's it. Like, comment, sub, or whatever if you want. See ya in the next video.